countdown to the last comic shop in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey! It is now time for serious talk here on the Last Comic Shop.
That's right. We are opening the shop up to newbies to help them find their way underneath this giant comic book tent and graphic novel and other forms of media.
That's right. We're keeping the lights on for the oldies that want to level up by reading some of those books that everybody talks about and ends up in the news from time to time, 25, 30 years after its publication, still causing a fuss out there.
Well, we hope that we don't cause much of a fuss on today's program. I'm the host with the most, Andy Larson, and I'm joined by Chad Smith and J.A. Scott, as well as the beautiful Nicole Larson, my wonderful wife, who we bring on for these more intellectual discussions here on The Last Comic Shop. So settle in, folks. It is time to bring out our NPR voices.
It's so cute that you think that I'm smart.
You know who has one of the best NPR voices? I think it's J.A. I think J.A. has one of the best.
Our phone lines are open. If you want to call in with your donations, it will go to this totally listener-supported podcast. You can have a chance to receive a tote bag in the mail for just a donation of $100. Phone lines are open.
And now it's time for Fresh Air.
You can actually get your tote bags for a lot less. Just go to the merch store.
That's true.
Forget these fun
You really
drives.
can. And we hope that you do. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. But on today's program, it is a promise that we're keeping to a lot of our Last Comic Shop fans. As you may remember, on a poll that J.A. posted on our Twitter page at Last Comic Shop quite a long time ago, we asked during our review of Persepolis. Did I say it right this time? All right.
Mostly. You had all the letters.
During that, we put out a poll. Basically, we gave a lot of other serious comic books and graphic novels that we should check out, and we put it out to our fans. And they overwhelmingly agreed that the next serious book that we should discuss on The Last Comic Shop should be Mouse. So here it comes, folks. The Last Comic Shop's review of this extremely important graphic novel. Pulitzer Prize winning. It doesn't happen very often, except if you're Gary Trudeau and you put out Doonesbury. Regardless, we're going to be doing Mouse on today's program. And
what were the other options?
I believe it was That Year of the Rabbit.
That J.A. had recommended.
Yes.
Okay.
And then Hey Kiddo, which I had never heard of.
Yeah.
And then I think the third one was
They Called Us Enemy.
They Called Us Enemy.
The George Takei one that I haven't read yet.
Yes. Yes. But we're going to be doing Mouse today, and before we get into that particular book, as Chad pointed out in the opening, this is a book that's banned a lot by small-minded people. That's what I said. I'm not going to pull any punches on today's program. Banning books is bad, and those people that do it have very small minds and very limited intellects. That's what I'm going to say. But J.A.'s got us a list of, I think, the top 10 most banned books of all time, or something like that.
Is a top 10. I don't know if it's the definitive top 10. There are a lot of different lists on the internet. And this is also kind of skewing towards an American audience. So it's a lot of U.S. and American books. So we're going to go with this top 10 because it has a nice collection of books that most people have probably read at some point, or as you pointed out, maybe saw the movie. Do you want me to just run down the full list and then we can sort of pull out some of these books that we...
give us the full list and then we'll go from there.
Okay. So 1984 by George Orwell, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, The Color Purple by Alice Walker, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, Lord of the Flies by William Golding, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, and To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee.
Chad, you are our resident teacher on all of our programs. What do you think of the whole notion of, number one, banning books and then this list? Like, what? I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of these books that you've actually taught in school.
Heck yeah. And so just before we go too far with the banned book list, each year, the American Library Association does a lot of great work in bringing light to books that are being banned across the country. You can check that out, the ALA.org, and check out Banned Book Week, which starts September 18th, where they can tell you books that are in the crosshairs for some of these issues. And a lot of times these books are banned for some of the language. There might be some curse words in there. I remember that was one of the ways I got a kid to read a book. I had a 10th grader who had never read a book before in his life. And he was big into, like the ESPN used to show the poker games.
Okay.
And so I got the book Bringing Down the House, which the movie 21 was based off of. It was like, here, this is all about poker. It has a ton of F words. You should check it out. And he did. And I got a kid to read a book. And it was a win. But a lot of people don't see it that way. And so for things like Mouse, this comes up with Catcher in the Rye. This comes up with so many other things. They have harsh language or depictions of violent events or serious or sad things.
Or sexual scenes.
Yeah, sexual
situations. And of reality of what actually happened. The language that was actually used when people talked to slaves. What quote actually happened during the Holocaust.
Moral dilemmas, moral issues.
Right. And the bad part is you take some of the best books off the table whenever you do that. Like as an educator, and I've taught in high school, I've taught in middle school, To Kill a Mockingbird, which shows up on that list. That was my favorite book to start with, especially as a young teacher, because you cannot screw it up. It is just such a great piece of American literature. And sure, there are notes that, don't play the same today in today's culture, but those things can be explained and discussed and dealt with. And I used to teach Catcher in the Rye to 11th graders. I had such fun teaching that book just because it's all about that angst. And so I remember before we would read the book as a pre-writing exercise, I would just tell the kids, I was like, all right, we're going to turn off all the filters here for a minute. I want you to, for 10 minutes, just free write whatever makes you angry. And I would get these lists, and it would be the one time kids would be excited about writing in my room. They would turn them in, and I'd pick one or two things off everybody's list and then print them out. And I would obviously keep the language school appropriate, make sure I was selecting things like that. But I would give them a copy of here are the things that make period 2 mad. And as we'd read through Catcher in the Rye and Holden Caulfield would be complaining about stuff, I'd be like, there it is, there it is, there it is. And it kept the kids entertained. And it also made them into, better readers. They were on the lookout for things then. And so when I was able to show them, hey, look at the words he uses on page 47. Now look at those words that he uses on page 145. And they unlocked kind of the stuff that's in there in the subtext. Like, kids actually cared. And you could see their minds being blown. But sometimes, it's taking those things that have a little bit of edge to them, that have some of those things that I, as a parent, I would agree. I'm not always comfortable with my kids being exposed to that stuff. But as Nicole alluded to earlier, when you're dealing with the real world, like, these are things that have happened. These are things that, they might be difficult, but they're worth discussing, especially, in a controlled place like a school or a library or, somewhere where they can have people to talk to about it.
Now, Chad, you might know more about this. So, obviously, when we talk about banned books, it's normally like banned by a certain school district, right? Or banned by like a certain, like, more local thing. It's not like, there's, like you said, the Library Association isn't banning these books. Is that true? It's kind of more school districts, or who's banning these books?
Yeah, so traditionally it'll come down in a community level. Like earlier in the year, we had read Persepolis, which was banned in my own backyard, where there were parents that were uncomfortable with some of the scenes and depictions there and things they thought were being normalized, quote unquote. And I'll be honest, the one thing that it does is turns these books into bestsellers. Yes. Like, as soon as a community tries to ban a book, the first thing people do is they go out there and they get that book. Right. They want to read it. They want to see what's up.
Yeah, no, it was recently I saw LeVar Burton. I think he was on one of these talk shows. He was showing some outrage about why people banning books and things. And of course, LeVar Burton, reading Rainbow. I mean, we all listen to LeBar when he talks about
take a look.
Yeah, and he basically said, you know what? That's what the banned books are, where you should be reading, because that's where all the good stuff is. And I won't lie, when J.A. gave this list, 2 of the books on that list I can say are probably in my top 10 books of all time. One of them we reviewed on this show, although in graphic novel form, 1984. The other one, equally as great, is Lord of the Flies. I spent an entire senior year just reading that book 3 or 4 times, just simply because I loved it so much. And it's a book that I don't think could be made into a movie. They've tried. And there's a somewhat okay one that was made in the 60s in Britain, but still, it doesn't have the effect of that book. So yeah. J.A., do you have a particular favorite off this list?
I think it's kind of funny that 1984 would be banned, since the whole book is about government control of speech. I read Huckleberry Finn when I was in high school, and I don't understand why that would be banned. Obviously, it was for the language and sort of some of the coarse portrayals of prejudice in that time. But what I think is lost on the people who banned it is the nuance that Mark Twain was trying to get at, and the fact that these books challenge you. And this is a sort of a question to Chad, I guess, because in college you're used to being challenged, and in high school I think you used to be challenged a bit. It seems that we've become a society that is afraid to challenge our children, and we want them to be in a quote-unquote safe space. But what that ends up meaning too often, or at least it seems to me, is that a safe space is a place where nothing can challenge their preconceptions about stuff, and they are never brought to task for an idea that they might think is correct that maybe is not correct, or somebody else has a different idea.
Right. Well, it's tough in the world we live in to know where the lines are and what some people might perceive as being challenging and some others perceive as indoctrination. And as an educator, it's always really tough. You want to make sure that you give a fair shake to issues and you let kids work things out in a way, that's humane. And I think, honestly, the pandemic was the first time that a lot of parents were exposed to the things their kids were reading or talking about because they were there. And they're like, what? Why are you dealing with this? And, as parents, we don't want to see our kids put in situations that are painful but at the same time, kids need to have those experiences. And so people lose sight of it sometimes. And their efforts to protect their kids from, all the terrible things out there, they don't give their kids that opportunity to grow, to work through things, to, deal with the messiness that comes with challenging people intellectually.
To build up their own armor, intellectual armor against ideas that they don't like or that they want to argue back against.
And to learn to think for yourself, sometimes you got to try things on and, try things out and find what works and find what doesn't. And like I said, it can be messy.
And walk in other people's shoes, which I think is very important, especially when you're a student. Figuring out and learning, it helps with empathy, how other people live and how other people have experienced the world.
And so you talked about walking a mile in another person's shoes, and that's one of my favorite pieces of advice, especially whenever there's conflict. To walk a mile in that other person's shoes, and that way you'll be a mile away and you'll have their shoes. Sucker!
Well, but like we talked about when we read Persepolis, you can't learn about these things without trying to literally step in someone's shoes or experience it through their story. And I'm going to get to it later with my recommendation, but there's a quote actually on the back of my recommendation book. It's one of those little blurb, praise for whatever book, but it talks about how, this book doesn't shirk away from, depicting the truth, and it respects the ability of these young readers to handle strong material. So I think that's really important when we talk about kids. And obviously there's a right age maybe, and it may be different for different kids depending on their sensibilities and things like that. But I think we're doing a disservice and
coddling. We're coddling our children.
Coddling them, and it's funny, if you actually just answer their questions and things. They have this curiosity, and then, it makes it not this taboo thing, right? It's the same thing with Mouse, and we're going to talk about the Holocaust, obviously. And, it's a really tough subject, but, if you just approach it in a very reasonable manner, these kids have the capability of working their way through it, and, they're going to have questions, and it's just our job to walk them through it.
Okay, well, we're going to walk you through Mouse right after these commercial breaks, so make sure that you stay tuned to more Last Comic Shop and more of this fantastic discussion right after these messages.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Pultizer. I'm an independent film director and screenwriter. I'm also an independent comic book artist and creator. I want to let you know about my podcast, the St. Paul Filmcast. It's a weekly podcast where I interview other independent filmmakers and other artists from the Twin Cities area. You can find the show on Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, and Amazon Radio, as well as distributor Podbean. You can follow the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So, if you're interested in how independent films get made or the process of filmmaking, also if you're interested in other artists' process and works as well, tune into my show, the St. Paul Filmcast, where it's not over till the guests say it's over.
And that wraps up our stimulating discussion on banned books. We now change topics and look at the focus of this week's episode, Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Chad, give us a little bit more background on the book we will be reading and discussing today.
Maybe, since we're all talking in NPR voices, Andrew will be quieter.
Yes.
Not bloody likely.
So, Mouse originally was published in Spiegelman's Raw magazine in a serialized form. And so the books that created Mouse Book 1 originally were there. And then in Book 2, some of those books were published as well in that serialized format before Spiegelman took a break and then finished the rest of Part 2 in the graphic novel itself. But interesting to note, as we talk about this book that won the Pulitzer Prize, it's won Eisner Awards, it's won all the praise, and Art Spiegelman, who'd gone on to work for The New Yorker and is, one of the biggest names in American cartooning, also worked on Wacky Packages and Garbage Pail Kids. And were it not for Atom Bomb and the other Garbage Pail Kids funding Art Spiegelman and giving him the opportunity to make his comics, without having to worry about financial concerns, we never would have had it. So we have our Garbage Pail Kids to thank for this one.
Okay, so Nicole, give us a 10-cent synopsis of Mouse.
So Mouse is autobiographical in many ways. So it is taking our author, Art Spiegelman, and he is in present time interviewing his own father, who was a survivor of the Holocaust. And he's actually in the process of making this book. And it depicts not only the conversations and the relationship that they have as the father's retelling the story and giving Art more detail, but then obviously we have the actual story of his survival as well.
And I won't lie,
Okay.
I liked some of those parts. The fact like he was buying the tape recorder and his dad was like, oh, you could have got a better deal on that tape recorder. One of my favorite parts between him and his dad is when his dad throws out his coat. He's like, here, you can have this windbreaker.
But why did he throw out his coat?
Because he thought it was old and ragged.
But he didn't throw out anything else. He returned half-eaten groceries.
True, but I think it had more to do with the fact he wanted to be viewed as somebody that took care of his son, and he didn't want his son going around in a ratty old coat. So I think that's why he threw it out in the trash and said, this coat is not worthy enough for my son. This windbreaker, this is a better coat.
Okay, so Andrew, initial thoughts outside of the coat.
You heard the whole book is really like cartoon depictions of what's going on. So all of the Jews are mice, and the Nazis are cats, and the Polish are pigs, and the Americans are dogs. And there's a section in which Art Spiegelman's dad and his mom are basically hiding in Poland, pretending to be Polish and not Jewish. And so they're walking around with pig masks. But you can see like the line that's attached to the mask to their face. And I just thought, boy, from a visual perspective, it may seem very simple, but how better to like show that you're wearing a false face or that you're hiding your identity than just wearing the mask of the other animals.
And it's the similar style to those old school Halloween masks that just had the rubber string kind of like stapled on there.
I was going to say he carried that motif forward into the second book where he was a human with the mouse face on at the beginning of the book when he's telling how his father had passed and Mouse 1 had taken off, and now he's struggling with how he's going to finish the book, because the whole first book is sort of the setup of the story and the run up to the first part of the war before they're caught and put into Auschwitz. And then the second book really deals with his father in Auschwitz and the experiences that he went through in Auschwitz, and also dealing with his father's death.
I thought it was interesting, too, because I asked Andrew about this while we was reading it, that he also had this mask on while he was talking to his therapist. It is hard to truly, like, try to unmask yourself. You know, we all kind of know the things that we're supposed to say and how we're supposed to act, but to really remove that mask. So, yeah, even at the therapist has a mask, and so does Art.
This story is so personal on so many levels. You know, whether it's Art Spiegelman's relationship with his father, Vladek, whether it is, you know, him dealing with the success of the book. Book 2, especially that Time Flies portion, is the part that came out after book 1 had been released. And you talk about survivor's guilt for the folks that had been through World War II and experienced those terrors. You know, now Art Spiegelman's put in this position where he's being elevated because of this and basically profiting off of this terrible story that belonged to his father. As he alluded to in earlier books, he already has anxiety. You know, his mother had committed suicide. He had nervous breakdowns. He already has a ton on his plate that he's dealing with. And so now you have this extra guilt of that success heaped on top of him. This is heartbreaking.
Yeah, I was going to say that his decision to use anthropomorphic animals also, while applauded and lauded in many circles, was not universally praised. There are a lot of literary critics who objected to using animal metaphor because they called it doubly dehumanizing, essentially reinforcing Nazi beliefs that it was one species against a different species. And Harvey Pekar even said that his use of animals was potentially reinforcing those stereotypes. He also was not very happy with how Spiegelman portrayed his own father as overwhelmingly negative, calling it disingenuous and hypocritical. So to use those animals, and I guess I open that up to the floor now. What do you think of the use of animals versus telling the story with humans?
Well, I'll say this. This was a book in which I had to put it down every 20 minutes because there was only so much I could emotionally take. I won't lie. I'm kind of an anxious guy myself. And this was it felt very claustrophobic at times where they were, talking about hiding in certain places and in coal bins and behind this and having to walk down the street and people following them. I really felt that paranoia. And so I had to put that book down. And I feel like instead of every 20 minutes, if it had been real people, it would have probably been every 5 minutes. The animal cartooning, it made it a little bit more digestible, kind of just putting a little bit of a coating on that bitter pill that this book you should swallow, but it's hard to swallow. It's hard on your psyche. And
what better way to show how ridiculous it was at the time than you could make the argument that is this a little bit racist or classicist, or I don't know what the right ist is. You could make that argument for sure, But when you're dealing with, Hitler and Nazi Germany and the dehumanizing of the Jews as people, it's such a clear way to show the delineation. And I'll go back to my favorite thing from Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. They go back to character abstractions. And the more abstract you can make your character, the more people that could potentially relate to what's going on in that character. And you already have a story that's so hard, as Andy was alluding to, so hard to read through. And I actually had the exact opposite experience where when I read this all within 2 days. I read book 1 day, I read book 2 the other day, just because that was how I dealt with it emotionally. It was like, okay, this is going to be bad. I'm going to power through. And that's how I had to do it. This wasn't a book I could stop and put down and ruminate on. Like if this were a movie, I wouldn't be able to sit through it. But because it's able to have that level of abstraction, I'm able to see not only the terrors of Auschwitz, not only the terrors of the Holocaust, not only the terrors that his father and his mother had to live through. Instead of being so overwhelmed with, disgust and fear and everything else, I can power through it because of the use of the anthropomorphic characters, because it's so simplified, yet it's still so emotionally powerful. Like the relatability is there, the ability to feel empathy for these characters is there, but it's like a spoonful of sugar. It puts it in that slightly more palatable form to get the story across.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it's something where I didn't think of it that way, Jay, when I was reading this. Honestly, those criticisms are valid, but that's also how it was during the Holocaust. I mean, these groups of people hated each other, you know what I mean? And so it did kind of take us away from one general humanity into these very specific racist tribes, these, different things. And so I don't have an issue with him using it. I think it was, again, as everyone said, it made it more palatable. To be honest, I feel a little guilty. I actually did not have as much trouble reading this as maybe you guys are alluding to. I've read a lot of Holocaust books, novels and things like that. And I feel like I am getting a little desensitized to it. The one part of this that actually caught me, literally caught me, had to slam the book shut. But at the beginning of book 2, it's kind of dedicated to his younger brother, his older brother. Oh. He never knew him because he died in the Holocaust. And it actually has the real picture of him. And that just completely gutted me for a long time. So
yeah, I had a similar reaction to the last line in the book. It's one of where his father's done with his story and he accidentally calls Art by his other son's name. He's like, Richelieu, we will talk later. It's at his end of his life and the father is in rough shape, but he's still thinking about that son that he lost. And that punched me in the face, among a lot of other things.
So you have the whole Holocaust story, which is terrible and anxiety inducing, but you also have Art Spiegelman's position. He has this brother who perished in the war. They ended up, to go long story short, as Andy would say, giving him to another family, I think we're aunts and uncles, to hide him during the war, and he ended up not making it out of the war. But now his older brother is someone that he's never going to be able to live up to the standard of his older brother, who's this perfect boy who doesn't have tantrums, doesn't do the things that kids do. And growing up, he had a sibling rivalry with a sibling that wasn't there. And how hard would that be on somebody? Oh, it's just on a human level beyond all the horrific big things. It's the horrific little things that really, they get you. They get me at least.
That was one thing, if I can shift the discussion a little bit, that stood out to me, because it wasn't just bookending Art Spiegelman's story with his dad's, where it would be Art Spiegelman saying, he starts book 1, hey, Dad, let's sit down and talk, and then it's just the story. I thought he definitely weaved in and out sort of modern, what's going on with his life, with his dad's life, with the dad's second wife, and sort of there's these weird sort of life as normal tragic yet funny moments all throughout, I felt. I mean, the question I wanted to ask is, how did you guys feel about, because yes, it's a book about Auschwitz and the Holocaust and you know, some very, very terrible things that happened, but it's not uniformly depressing. There are moments of levity, there are moments of comedy, there are moments where I laughed out loud at the writing. I hope I wasn't the only one who experienced that.
Well, I think that's what I was trying to say. I feel like I've been a little desensitized to the Holocaust stories. But what I liked about this book was the modern relationship between Art and his dad. And some of it was hilarious. You know, his dad's such a cheapskate. He wanted to trade it or, you know, return half-eaten food back to the grocery store was just by taping up the boxes. I mean, there were really funny moments, but what was sad to me is that I felt that their relationship was just so not in a good place. I hope by the end it was in a little bit better place, but I honestly didn't feel like it did. Even at the end, I felt like Art really saw his dad as a burden and maybe took him for granted a little bit. I'm not sure if y'all felt that way, but I didn't feel that there was like a whole lot of love. It really just felt like, oh, I'm kind of obligated to take care of this guy and I'm going to write a book about his life. So I like seeing that, but I was also a little turned off by it. Does that make sense?
No, I agree that there were times, you know, the one thing about his dad, like you could call him like a cheapskate or whatever, but he was molded by this life that he had to live. Like this guy's a survivor. Like that's one of the things you read this book. Yes, there was a lot of like luck that played a big part in him surviving this terrible thing that basically killed most of the rest of his family. But at the same time, like you could tell that like he had picked up tools like, you know, hey, I was working in a tin shop and I became a tinsmith. So then I became valuable. So the notion of him taping up a box of cereal and taking it back so that he could get a little bit of extra money back. He was trained that like you don't waste things. You don't take things for granted. And if you can figure out some way of getting a little bit more, it might save you tomorrow. And that's how he stayed alive.
It was just such a human story where I don't think Art Spiegelman was looking to make himself look great or look like the hero of anything. It's him, you know, dealing with his father who had, you know, suffered all these traumas, and, you know, Art who, you know, he lays clear, you know, the struggles that, you know, he's had. And
that's very true. I'll give him props because, you know, I'm sitting here going, oh, he kind of looked like an a-hole. I mean, he was the author. He could have depicted himself in, you know, whatever light he decided to. And so, you know, props to him if that's, you know, really the relationship that he was, you know, kind of open and honest about it, at least.
Right. But I guess what I'm getting at is we see a lot of the warts and we see a lot of the struggles and we see a lot of dealing with trauma and, you know, words far worse than that. But there's that love there too, that, you know, he comes back to take care of his father. Like he wants to come for a couple of days and he ends up staying. And like, you know, is that a burden? Yeah. Like, would you complain about that? Yeah, sure. Why not? Has to pause his life basically to take care of his dad, but it's the love that's keeping him there. It's the I don't know, just the whole humane aspect of dealing with all these different things. And it's not a glorified portrayal. It's one of like, this is what the reality was. And even though the reality is portrayed by mice and cats and people with pig masks.
And I give his dad a lot of credit because, like, honestly, this was a son that there was a lot of traumatic things that happened just in their relationship. I mean, not only did you deal with like the Holocaust, but you had the mother of the relationship take her own life and the effect that it had on both the father and the son in that situation, and the guilt that they had, the loss that they had. But at the same time, like, these were people that were struggling to connect, right? The son just wants to hear this story, just wants to get it down. He's almost like methodical and very like to the point, like, Dad, stay on topic. Like, I'm writing this book and you have to say it in this order, like, or people will get lost. And all his dad, it seems to do at times, is just want to talk to his son. Wants to have some sort of relationship with his son where, like, that'll open up the fact that maybe his son will come over and help him fix the roof because he's worried about the roof. And his son's not worried about the roof, but he is, and he needs help. And so I felt for the dad that, look, he didn't have to talk about these horrific things that happened in his life. He didn't have to share that story, but he did because he wanted to talk to his son.
Yeah, and if you're that dad, that's not an experience you want to relive. Like, that's not something you're eager to talk about, the time, when he had to give your son away. But for his son, he does these things. For his son, he makes these sacrifices. For his son, he brings out the wooden hangers. For his son, he throws out that old ratty coat so that he can have a nice coat and present himself. Like, he wants to make a better life for his son, but he's also a real pain in the butt to deal with. And that leads to some of the comedy. That leads to some of the fun of the book that, helps you to not just be so overwhelmed by all the terribility here.
Okay, well, we're going to take a slight break for some commercials, and we will come back with ratings for Mouse and recommendations.
Welcome to Victims and Villains. This is the channel where we talk nerd, we talk hope, and we speak nothing else. I'm your host, Captain Nostalgia, and I'm so glad that you're here to join us.
Victims and Villains is a podcast and YouTube channel that marries pop culture and suicide prevention, producing content with the intent to let people know that there is hope and that there is a better way, and that each and every listener has value and worth.
Listen to Victims and Villains on your favorite podcast catcher or on YouTube by searching for Victims and Villains. Also, check out their website, victimsandvillains.net.
Looking for a podcast all about nerddom?
Want a podcast with an emphasis on representation?
The Nerd Alternative is the podcast for you. Join me, Ram.
Me, Hassan.
And me, Levi.
3 black British nerds tackling the pop culture we love and sharing why we love them. The Nerd Alternative, a sweet melting pot of all things nerdy.
And we're back for the ratings for Mouse. We like to do a 1 out of 4 scale, usually related to the book. And this week, we're going to do 1 out of 4 talks with Dad. Since the whole book is essentially talks with Dad that have been turned into a story. So why don't we go to Nicole first?
I don't know.
What is your rating?
I'm going to give this a solid 3.5. Like I said, I feel like I've gotten a little desensitized to Holocaust books, but this was really well done. I did like that it was more, in a way, about his relationship with his dad. There was only really one area that, like, kind of made me a little sick to my stomach, and I'm wondering if that's why some people wanted things to be banned. There was a depiction of, like, a mass grave and then pouring gasoline over people, and that was maybe a little much for me. But yeah, solid 3.5. It wasn't probably the best Holocaust story I've read ever, but I guess I can compare it to Anne Frank, the graphic novel version of that I've read, and it did deal a lot more with the concentration camps and things than that did. But yeah, overall, very solid, well done. Shouldn't be banned because nothing should be.
Okay, Andrew.
Oh, this is a 4. Oh, this is a 4. This is like a 5, 6, 7. I don't know, 8 talks with Dad. This is, I mean, probably one of the best books we've ever reviewed on this show. And I'm sorry. I mean, even though I had to put it down every 20 minutes, this book will change you. Like, this is a book you have to kind of read, not only just because it educates you on something that I feel like a lot of folks would rather just forget about because they're just like, well, that didn't involve me. This happened. This was a horrific event in history. One group of people systematically murdered another group of people. It's happened before. It'll happen again. Unless we keep on revisiting these things and learning about them and trying to see that, like, these patterns, they're slow, they're incremental, but they end up just being extremely deadly. And I just want to say, like, that's what you have to educate. That's why you have to educate your kids. That's why you have to read Mouse. But not only that, but it's a great story between, again, a father and a son. And my heart goes out to the dad. I really felt for him this entire time. Like, not only was he a survivor, he was a very smart guy. He was very capable. And he just wanted to be with his son, and his son just wanted to write this book. And whatever the reason, they reconnected, and that was great. And so if you are a son or a daughter, and you need something to reconnect with your parent about, maybe ask them about their lives. Maybe ask them to say, hey, can you tell me the story about you before you're gone so that I can remember that? I won't maybe write a book, but I need to know what your story was so that I can then tell my kids about it someday. And it's an 8. We'll just say that.
All right. Chad.
As the tears start falling down my eyes.
Yikes. Wow. So I'll stick with the traditional four talks with Dad. It is such a powerful book, and there's so many different levels to it. It all starts at the beginning whenever Artie is young and he breaks his skate and his friends just keep rolling past and he's all upset and he's telling his dad, he's like, friends, yeah, let him lock you in a room for a week with no food, then you'll see what friends are. And like, oh my goodness. And people have asked, Art Spiegelman, why did you go with mice for the symbol here for the Jews? And he talked about how, as a people, they were so defenseless. And when I read this initially, the Holocaust wasn't something we talked a lot about in school. It wasn't something that was top of mind or, something that was explored in depth. And so I spent more time learning about the Holocaust here than I probably had in my public school education. But it's more than that. It's not just a Holocaust story, although that's in there. And you see how crafty Vladek has to be to survive, whether it's, saying, yeah, I'm a tinsmith, even though, he had just watched people. Yeah, I can make shoes. I can repair your shoes because he had seen people do it and he'd figured it out. But you have the relationship between the father and the son. You see the ripples of how these horrific events have impacted people and generations upon generations. And you're reminded of those things you need to remember. And you also see, how hard it was. And it's not something that, just when the war ended, it was all over and everything was fine and everything went back to the way, you think things should be. And it's not easy. So we talked earlier about, should this book be banned? No, absolutely not. But it's nice to not read it alone. It's nice to have a support group to talk about it with. It's nice to be able to deal with some of these atrocities. I don't know, have some other outlets there. But it's powerful stuff. So just know that ahead of time. 4 out of 4.
All right. So. Well, I think I'm going to give it a 3.75. I think it is an incredibly powerful book. The fact that he used the comic book medium to tell this story, I think reinforces how unreal and intense Auschwitz was. And, I think it makes it easier to deconstruct, if you will, and understand as a human being. I mean, because I think if you think about Auschwitz and you think about everything that went on there and everything that went on with the final solution, it's hard as a human to wrap your mind around that sometimes. The amount of evil and the amount of horror that existed and what we as humans could do to other human beings. And so I think the comic book medium helps to tell that and deconstruct it a bit and allow us to understand it maybe a little bit more than we could if it was just dealing with it on a human by human level where it's, incomprehensible. On the other side of things, I can see some of the criticism of falling back on some stereotypical tropes. I also, I wouldn't say that his son did him dirty, but Vladek wasn't exactly portrayed as the most sympathetic character through parts of the story, especially in his older age. He kind of became the curmudgeonly, almost stereotypical, cheap penny pincher, and I could see where that could make some people uncomfortable. All that aside, and that's probably why I don't give it a 4. I think it's an incredible story. It's very powerful. The art is powerful. It's a heavy read, Andrew. As you said, you had to stop every 20 minutes or so. It's very text-based. It's very conversational-based. This is not something that you can flip by 3 or 4 pages of nothing but images. It's a lot of reading. but with those nice little moments of levity in between that I think makes it so that it's not so heavy and dense. So 3.75, I think. Well, so in addition to Mouse, some other recommendations in books we suggest that should also not be banned and on your reading list. So I guess we'll just go around the table like we did for the rating section. And Nicole, why don't you lead us off? What book are you recommending that our listeners can read in addition to Mouse?
So I am going with an additional Holocaust-themed book. I actually just picked this up on Free Comic Book Day earlier this year. It wasn't free, but when you're there, you have to look around, and I found this and thought it looked beautiful on the cover. But anyhow, it is called White Bird by R.J. Palacio. You may recognize that name. She is the author of the book Wonder, which was then turned into a pretty popular movie. And this is a fictional story. It's actually taking one of the side characters from Wonder and that whole world and telling the story of his grandmother, who was a Jew that was entangled in the Holocaust story as well. It is geared towards young adult, which, like I said earlier in the show, I think we need to give our kids credit in their ability to comprehend these things on some level, whether that's the Holocaust, whether it's 9/11, whether it's racism, whether it's gay rights, things like that. I think we need to give our kids a lot of credit for what they can process and what they might have some interesting feedback on. So, this is, very much ties into our discussion about Mouse. And of course, I've recommended it before, and I just have to throw it in there. The graphic novel depiction of Anne Frank's diary was also very well done. So if that's your thing, I highly suggest that.
All right, Andrew.
Yeah, talking about books at libraries and how you can find great things there. I found my recommendation at the library for a whole $1. Yes, it was in one of their used selling books things, and it comes from a pair that a lot of Last Comic Shop fans should be very well versed in, given how much we talk about them. Yes, that is Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. We've talked about Criminal. We've talked about Reckless. Today I'm talking about an original graphic novel. My heroes have always been junkies, and it is an interesting story about two young adults. One's named Ellie, quote unquote, and the other one's named Todd, and they meet at a rehab facility, and the story about their love affair, while at the same time the story of Ellie's troubled past. Her father is in a prison. And I think that J.A. would love this book, not only because it is crime noir, and he loves crime noir, but J.A., one of the wonderful things about this is it gives you almost like a track list. Because parts of this, very similar to the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, Ellie talks a lot about mixtapes that her mother left her, and some of the songs that she played over and over and over again. So some songs that I've been checking out just because I read this particular book include the following: Darn That Dream by Billie Holiday, Hickory Wind by Graham Parsons and Emmylou Harris, Between the Bars by Elliott Smith. And the interesting thing about all of these particular songs is they were all written by junkies. That's where the title of the book comes from. All her heroes were also junkies. In fact, at one point of the book, she wants to go to the hotel in Joshua Tree where Graham Parsons died of a drug overdose. It's a very interesting character study of this young woman and her love affair with this guy at a rehab facility that I'm not going to give too much away. You just need to read this book. It's really good. And it doesn't take very long either.
All right. Maybe somebody has put together a Spotify playlist for the book that you can listen to while you read it. If not, maybe something Last Comic Shop can look into. So, Chad, what are you recommending for us this week?
So for my pick, I'm going to go back into the more traditional superhero comic verse and talk about a story that is part of the X-Men lore. It is X-Men God Loves, Man Kills by Chris Claremont and Brett Anderson. we know X-Men has those allusions to dealing with the civil rights movement, and in this particular story, there are some religious zealots who are out trying to turn people against mutants, and it's a very powerful story. I don't want to say too much about it, just because it's something that should be experienced, but like several other banned books that find themselves kicking up some of the hornet's nests, there is some language in there that I don't know if they would use today if they were telling that story, but it was released in 1982, part of Marvel's graphic novel series. It was number 5. It's just so powerful. Like Kitty Pryde in this story and her standing up to these politicians and these religious folks, you could see how people can use hatred to try to turn a culture against other people. And it's just, with everything we've talked about today and how heavy it is, this is, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm running out of words. Help me out, Andy.
Right. No, I mean, for nothing else, you should read this book just because it's got one of the most iconic panels in all comic books, where that crazy preacher is pointing at Nightcrawler, and you dare call that thing human?
Yeah.
Nightcrawler, who is honestly one of the nicest X-Men you would ever want to meet. He's the one that's being singled out as looking different, and so therefore he's evil and subhuman or something. You just need to read it. It's so good.
And stands up to this day, I think.
For sure. All right, Jay, what do you think folks should read out there?
Well, I am recommending the graphic adaptation of the 9/11 report by Sid Jacobson and Ernie Colon. So this is based on the final report of the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States. Especially now that most high school students and even college students were born after this event happened, it is a approachable and easily understood way of delving into the report. And what they're able to do in the graphic novel that they couldn't do in the report so much is there's a whole section that just talks about the timeline of the different airplanes and the strikes on the buildings and what was going on and police response and military response. But they do it in a graphic layout where you can see the timeline going the whole time across like 10 pages. It's able to grab big chunks of information and distill them into maps and images, and it takes what is a very dry congressional report and makes it readable and dramatic and interesting, and not unlike Mouse and some of the other books we've recommended, I think still timely to this day and an important piece of history that should be read.
And just as a comic book nerd, books like that and books like Mouse, they do things with the form of comics that you can't do in a movie. Like they play with time in such a way, they lay things out like almost like a diagram. It really does. It's such a powerful thing, and it's something that comics are built for this kind of thing. So great pick, great pull on that one.
Yeah. And we hope that you come back next week for more great pulls from the Last Comic Shop. We promise more sound effects next week. Yeah. I mean, it's not going to all be these heavy things. And if you want some more lighter episodes, make sure that you go back and listen to some of our past ones. Like, I don't know, our last Chicken Shop Challenge. That one's hilarious. Go listen to that one. That was earlier this summer. And in case, you can listen to all of those at www.lastcomicshoppodcast.com. Terrific place where you can rate, review, and subscribe. And we hope that you do. Chad, where can they find us all on the social medias?
At Last Comic Shop. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram, where you can find weekly polls. You can find what we're picking up at the comic shops. You can find factoids and Golden Age covers to tuck in at night. And if you need help finding those, you can always go back to the podcast home base at www.lastcomicshoppodcast.com, where they can find what else, J.A.?
Well, they have a link to our merch store. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you can have a tote bag for much cheaper than it costs to support your local PBS station, but you should still support your local PBS station, please. And T-shirts, mugs, all the Last Comic Shop merch that you can find on the merch store for you or your favorite comic book nerd.
There you go. And while we might be the Last Comic Shop podcast, we don't want to be the last comic shop. So we encourage you guys to head out there, and check out some of the great books we talked about today. Things like Mouse from Art Spiegelman, things like White Bird, things like X-Men, God Loves, Man Kills, or the 9/11 Report, a graphic adaptation by Sid Jacobson and Ernie Colon. All that stuff and more can be found at your local comic shop, so get out there and support those folks.
Yeah, we hope that you come back to the Last Comic Shop next week. I was the host with the most, Andy Larson. I was joined by Jay Scott, Chad Smith, and the beautiful and very, very intelligent Nicole Larson. And until
Sounds like
next
he's buttering
week,
me up for something.
and until next week, stay safe, stay educated, and remember that if somebody tells you not to read something, you should go and read it, because that's where the good stuff is. Yeah.
And don't get mad at your dad when he throws your coat out.
He wanted to get you that nice windbreaker. I got you it.
He wants you to have nice things. That's him trying.
Don't take the mamas and papas for granted.
The Last Comic Shop was a 2022 Black Angus production.